Hello everybody, welcome to Bitcoin Not Crypto. My name is Forrest Stevens, and in today's video, I'm going to be exploring what happened with El Salvador and the new IMF loan for $1.4 billion. I'll be going through the entire details, especially the points on how they want to confine some of the Bitcoin stuff that happened in Bitcoin country, El Salvador. Before I do that, however, if you want to get yourself some Bitcoin, the place I recommend going is Bitcoin Well. There's actually a code popping up from Bitcoin Well. It's part of their reward system. If you're the first to scan this with a Lightning wallet, you'll get some free Bitcoin. And if you use my link in the description, you'll also get some free Bitcoin. The reason I like Bitcoin Well is they have the lowest fees for a non-custodial exchange. A non-custodial exchange means they never hold your Bitcoin for you. You send them cash, they send you Bitcoin directly to cold storage. It's the best way to eliminate third-party risk. They also have some non-KYC options that might work for you, and they are traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange Ventures. If you want to check them out, like I said, link in the description. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, made a deal with El Salvador just recently, the last couple days, where they will give them $1.4 billion over a 40-month period. That's probably going to be, certain checks throughout that time, so they don't just get it all at once. In that period of time, it can also lead to other funding from other partners, so up to $3.5 billion estimated. With partners from like the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other regional development banks. So basically in this loan agreement is the idea that it can lead to further loans. The goal of this, as stated by the IMF, is that the funding program is to help increase GDP and help to firm the path along lowering overall debt over the long term, and help lower the borrowing costs and improve sovereign debt terms. So it's kind of like you take a loan now at the existing rates that they're willing to give. If that can help increase the GDP, then if that nation wants to borrow money again, they have an increased GDP. And they look more profitable, which means that they can get lower interest rates, and they've been paying down this IMF debt. That's kind of like the goal and the vision that the IMF has for this, at least forward facing. There are some terms in this funding that are a little bit problematic, and we're kind of going to go into them. I think any deal, like I'm not obviously not in control of a developing nation, and so I don't know how all the interworkings work, but the IMF is not an organization that I would want to be involved with. They basically provide debt where others wouldn't, and therefore are able to control what a nation does. There's terms in this agreement that are directly affecting the laws in El Salvador, which means they have control over certain aspects of the government, right? There's terms in there that dictate what the government can do. So they control that part of what the government does. And this is kind of what happens with debt, right? There's this saying that debt is slavery, right? And I think that's, when you hear that, that might sound a little jarring. That might sound a little extreme, but it is in part a very specific form of slavery. Like, if you have personal debt, that it forces you to work, right? It's that tiny little part of, okay, well, I no longer have control over this part of my life. So just as that happens in a personal way, this debt that El Salvador is taking on, they no longer have control over these specific terms that the IMF wants changed. So one of these terms that the IMF wants changed as part of the deal is that Bitcoin adoption by corporations and companies is voluntary instead of mandatory. In 2021, El Salvador wrote in a Bitcoin law that got passed within 90 days, I believe, that made it so that any sort of big company, any big business needed to accept Bitcoin as legal tender, and it was a mandatory thing. However, it turns out that this was not really heavily enforced. It ended up being that it was said that way, but then never like enforced by law. It didn't include small businesses as it just as like a mandatory thing because it felt like that was too difficult to enforce as well. So it was more for bigger businesses, and then again it wasn't enforced. So this shift to kind of the wording of it from being mandatory to voluntary is more of like a win just for the IMF in a wording alone, and kind of a controlling aspect. However, it is a lot less meaningful in the real world than it might seem. And I just want to put my opinion in there as well. I think that making Bitcoin acceptance mandatory, making it, forcing a company to accept Bitcoin is really against the ethos of Bitcoin. Bitcoin has always been a voluntary network. It's permissionless, and it means that you can join it if you see a benefit in joining it. And the thing is here is that the companies, the businesses, the people that have adopted Bitcoin and continue to hold that Bitcoin from 2021 until now have outperformed, if rather than having just accepted the other legal tender in El Salvador, which is the US dollar, right? Bitcoin has outperformed the US dollar. So if you're competing in a space and you can earn more money because you're tapped into the growth engine that is Bitcoin, then you have beaten your competitors in a bottom line kind of way, which can allow you to hire better talent or to expand or to be just more fiscally responsible, take on less debt, and be better positioned to have a more profitable business in the future. So I think that is the way, that is like, there's a natural incentive in Bitcoin to adopt Bitcoin, and that is the number go up technology. That speaks for itself, right? And Bitcoin has been this really grassroots thing. I mean, now institutions are getting into it, but we've had whatever, 14, 15 years or whatever, 16 years maybe even, to front run all of these institutions, businesses, and now nation states. So we've had a long time to front run this. This has been grassroots along the way. Another part of this term with the Bitcoin side of this is that taxes are now only to be paid in US dollars. That seems like an overreach, right? Like this is an organization that's giving a loan that's saying, hey, you as a government now need to accept this currency as opposed to another. That is really interesting to me, and something that I don't think is a good thing. I'm not sure how many people paid taxes in Bitcoin in El Salvador. I don't know if that was a popular thing to do or not. And maybe that will incentivize more hodlers of Bitcoin because they will just spend their worst currency, which is US dollars. But to me, that seems like maybe not a great change. Another aspect is that Chivo, which is a government Bitcoin and Lightning wallet, which was part of the initiative of onboarding the public, will be wound down. And now there's not really much more details about that, but what people are kind of speculating is either that will be sold into the private sector or completely shut down and basically just dissolved. This is an app that gave a lot of people a negative experience of Bitcoin because of how buggy it was. Supposedly, I've never used it. The onboarding effort of Chivo was that there was $30 of Bitcoin preloaded for Salvadorians, and a lot of those Salvadorians ended up, exchanging that for dollars, just cashing out, kind of, not really trusting Bitcoin, having a bad image of it, prior to learning about it. There's obviously Bitcoin scams out there, crypto scams that they associate with it. There's also this history of dual currencies and one kind of taking over another in El Salvador from 20 years ago. And so I think there was just like a little bit of mistrust and misunderstanding at the beginning. And I think the Chivo app, from what I understand of this, is that this app kind of left a bad taste in people's mouths, because the user experience, right? The front-facing app was buggy, laggy, didn't work properly. So they thought, okay, well, this isn't going to work. This doesn't work. I'll just continue using what has worked, which is US dollars. From my understanding, a lot of people use Blink. There's probably other apps as well that they use for Lightning and for Bitcoin. So one thing here that I think less people are talking about, but which is kind of concerning to me, is that early reforms of the terms is fiscal transparency. So IMF is urging and kind of needing the El Salvadorian government to have more fiscal responsibility, and to, what it says here is to focus on establishing a strong anti-corruption framework and improve the anti-money laundering and counter-financial terrorism agreements in line with international best practices. So that's all good, right? You don't want money laundering. You don't want counter-financial terrorism. That's all great. But these things have been used in the developing world to enforce KYC, which is know your customer. Basically, AML, especially anti-money laundering, has been a huge reason for politicians to make it mandatory for, say, every single operating crypto on-ramp in America to have KYC. And KYC does not protect people. It actually puts their data in a big honeypot where somebody like data leakers and data hackers can hack into these companies, put all the personal information and sell it, basically get access to it. And it actually is a lot more dangerous to have done KYC on a lot of these platforms than to not have KYC. Now, is there sort of some way to control maybe money laundering that happens? Well, Bitcoin is a public ledger. It's actually pretty difficult to be really private on Bitcoin. The idea of Bitcoin was never it was never really to be this private money where people can transact on the dark web. Like it ended up becoming that because people didn't really understand it, or it worked in that way at an early stage to some degree. But since then, there's been all of these privacy coins that have ledgers that people don't even know the full amount of the coins. They have closed source code. They have basically a lot of question marks in the authenticity of the whole ecosystem. And this comes down to Bitcoin being a way of having more transparency, right? If everybody if nation states adopted Bitcoin as their only currency, they couldn't fudge the numbers, they couldn't print money, right? Proof of work stops that. And we would actually see how much money they have, because we would have access to visually see their public wallet through their public keys. So this adds more transparency in a financial world where we as the citizenry have a lot less say and a lot less knowledge about what's actually going on behind what the governments do. So that being said, with these changes, these kind of broad general guidelines that the IMF has here, we don't know what this means into the future. I see this as a little bit of a gateway of saying, okay, well, if you're going to use Bitcoin as a Salvadorian, now you need KYC, right? There's a lot of non-KYC options available for Salvadorians because Bitcoin is treated as a currency. It's not taxed, and there's no implications of it besides the same implications that happen with US dollars, right? So if you think about your implications of using your native currency wherever you are, the same is for Bitcoin in El Salvador. So I kind of see the AML side of this being like a little bit of a Trojan horse for IMF to start implementing these kind of more restrictive policies on Bitcoin usage. That's really to be seen in the future. I don't know. This is just, for me, this is like a little bit of a red flag, seeing this AML kind of terminology put into some of these terms. Another part of the goal of this this loan for the IMF is to increase liquidity for private bank reserves. Currently, they're only obligated to hold 11.5% of deposits in El Salvador, and they want to up that to 15% of deposits by June 2026. So that is taking money out of the the ability to print it, which creates stimulus, which creates inflation, but also creates growth to some degree as well, albeit artificial and unsustainable. So this is overall a good thing. Like, I think the reserves of banks should be way higher, right? Like we should allow if it slows the economy down by having higher deposits in banks and less money printing, then that's fine. Like, we need to accept that. We need to get to there. And I think that, basically this is a year and a half away that they have to up their deposits. So this will be a fairly slow thing, and overall puts a lot less risk on the private sector, loans and things like that, and bank runs and all this, right? So this is probably a good thing overall, I would say. There's nothing explicit in these terms that say that Bitcoin can't be used for legal tender, which is, key for no taxes on purchases. I'm going to read this part out here. This is from imf.org. The potential risks of the Bitcoin project will be diminished significantly in line with fund policies. Legal reforms will make acceptance of Bitcoin by the private sector voluntary. For the public sector, engagement in Bitcoin-related economic activities and transactions in and purchases of Bitcoin will be confined. This part here, again, very general, very kind of vague what that means. Confined. What does it mean to confine purchases by the public sector, right, the government, of Bitcoin? What's very interesting with this terminology is right after all of this was announced, El Salvador, having gone from buying one Bitcoin every single day, I think since 2022, something like that, every single day they've been buying one Bitcoin, and it's publicly visible in their wallet. They bought 11 Bitcoin. This is the first time they've done that since doing that one a day. So it's kind of to signal, hey, we've accepted this $1.4 billion with some confinement of our Bitcoin laws and some changes to our Bitcoin laws, but they're signaling, hey, we're still in this, and in fact, we're actually going to double down. Or is it kind of a fake out? Is it like, okay, we're doing this to kind of convince people everything's okay, but or could it be we're doing this now because we're not going to be able to do this in the future, because it's possible that the IMF will lay down some laws for the next round of funding, right? The next check, right? This 1.4 billion is given out over 40 months. They could potentially renege and stop if some of these terms to their discretion aren't being met, right? How concrete is that $1.4 billion, and how important is that $1.4 billion for Nayib Bukele and the public sector in El Salvador, right? Maybe they really need that. Maybe they think that they can outgrow the strategy that they're currently doing with their Bitcoin stuff. So I don't know, but I think that's something to be concerned about potentially. Taxes will only be paid in the US dollars, and government participation in the crypto e-wallet Chivo will gradually be unwound. Transparency, regulation, and supervision of digital assets will be enhanced to safeguard financial stability, consumer and investor protection, and financial integrity. I wouldn't want the IMF helping me enhance my safeguarding of my financial digital wallet and my digital assets. I don't want them supervising, right? That's what it says, supervision of digital assets. I think that's not good. Again, I think that's not good. I think El Salvador has become a little less sovereign by agreeing to this loan overall. I think it's a totally mixed bag. I think probably the $1.4 billion will be used in ways that end up improving the lives of Salvadorians. Hopefully, that's a hopeful way of looking at this, because I also think that they are accepting a deal with the devil. The IMF has caused an extreme amount of destruction around the world, and I don't see myself in a position, because I'm not the president of a developing nation. I would really try to avoid taking on debt from an organization like the IMF or the World Bank if they continue taking on debt, this 3.5 billion. There's also nothing in here that talks about the interest rates on this debt, the kind of the agreements of how that's all made. So maybe this is a really good deal in that way. The other thing I see here, right, like I see with this confinement in this terms here, this kind of indicates to me that this isn't going to be a Giga Chad moment of Nayib Bukele taking this 1.4 billion and taking every single check they get over the next 40 months and smash buying Bitcoin with it. It says the purchases of Bitcoin will be confined. I think that this 11 Bitcoin they bought instead of 1, this is possibly, and I really hope that I'm wrong, but this is possibly kind of a last, like, let's get it in before this all goes down, right? Let's stack as much as possible before we're not able to, or have the potential to not be able to. Now, supposedly, this is another thing that I see here, right? Like, El Salvador is growing as a nation. A lot of people are moving back to El Salvador. A lot of new money, investor money is coming in. A lot of foreigners are moving to El Salvador. This has skyrocketed the cost of living, especially with housing. This is what happens when a lot of new people move somewhere. I live in Canada. Don't even get me started on housing costs. It's insane here because of immigration. And building laws and tax code or permit laws and all this nonsense. Anyway, in El Salvador, they need capital to kind of build into this growth that they're having. So all of that could be good for their bottom line, which will allow them to continue to hold that Bitcoin that they have, that they continually buy, and not to have to liquidate it for paying debts, right? If they can continue to have this kind of growth, this could end up being a negative signal to the world outside of El Salvador. A lot of people are moving to El Salvador because of the Bitcoin laws. So maybe that will slow down a little bit with these slight changes that are happening here. However, they've experienced a ton of growth. They need to do a lot of construction. They need to upgrade their infrastructure like crazy. And so maybe that is what they'll use this money for. Some other speculation out there, of course, is that Nayib Bukele said that they found deposits of trillions of dollars worth of gold. Now, they have a current mining ban that was created in 2017 that says there will be no metal mining in El Salvador. Now, they would have to revoke that law. They would have to allow metal mining, which creates environmental, problems. Gold mining is terrible for the environment. However, if they could use, part of that 1.4 billion to start mining gold again, maybe they could extract that gold. They would have that on their balance sheet at a lower cost than it would take to buy that gold outright. And they could sell that gold and buy a better asset, which is Bitcoin. I mean, there's all these potentials of what they could use this money for. We're still in early days in this kind of experiment of Bitcoin country and of being a developing nation, having this partnership and interaction with IMF. It's a very interesting thing to look into. I'm a little undereducated on this. This is something that I will continue learning about, and I also think that this is an interesting development in the story of El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption, which I will be covering more in depth and more fully in a film that I am in very early pre-production of, which is called The Land of Volcanoes and Bitcoin, which is the full exploration of El Salvador's adoption of Bitcoin, which I'm actually funding with Geyser. If you want to send some Bitcoin my way to make that film a reality, there's a link in the description to help fund that film, which I was hoping to start filming at the beginning of 2025, but there's been a development in my life personally that will require me here in my home country. A good development, I will say, and I'll tell you guys a little bit more about that as it comes along. But it makes it so that I can't travel when I was hoping to. So now it's going to be looking like the end of 2025 is when I'm actually going to go to El Salvador, which I think will be interesting, right? A lot of what this development in the Bitcoin story will start to play out by then, and I should have more of an idea of what Bitcoin looks like going into and after all of these changes have been implemented. So if there's anything that I missed here, anything that you've seen, read, heard about this story that you want to fill in some gaps, maybe the comment section on YouTube is a good place for that. And if you, again, want to buy some Bitcoin, hold it in self-custody and stack as hard as Nayib Bukele has, you know, he's up 133 million, I believe, on that Bitcoin stack of his. You can do so with Bitcoin Well using my code Bitcoin Not Crypto, or just click the link in my description. Thanks everybody for watching.